The hardest person to lose is the one you never imagined living without. If someone had asked Mason Brooks to name the most reliable thing in his life, he would have answered without hesitation. Ethan Walker. Not his steady job as a fire investigator. Not the little craftsman house he had spent 3 summers restoring with his own hands. Not even the old pickup truck that somehow refused to die after 200,000 miles. It had always been Ethan. The funny thing was, Mason had never stopped to wonder why. Ethan had simply always been there, like sunrise after a long night or fresh coffee waiting on the kitchen counter during early fishing trips. They met when they were 12 years old after Ethan accidentally knocked over Mason's science fair project. Instead of arguing, Ethan had stayed after school to help rebuild the entire thing using cardboard, glue, and more optimism than either of them probably deserved. They finished just before the janitor locked the building, covered in glitter and laughing so hard their stomachs hurt. Somehow that had become the beginning of everything. 15 years later, almost nothing had changed. Ethan still laughed first. Mason still rolled his eyes before smiling anyway. Every Friday evening they met at the same neighborhood diner where the waitress no longer bothered asking what they wanted because she already knew. Bacon cheeseburger for Mason. Turkey club with extra pickles for Ethan. Black coffee for both, even though Ethan insisted coffee tasted like burned tree bark. He drank it anyway because Mason always ordered a second cup. Their routines had become invisible, stitched quietly into everyday life until neither of them noticed them anymore. Mason certainly didn't. To him, Ethan was simply Ethan, the guy who remembered birthdays without setting reminders. The guy who showed up at 6 in the morning to help replace a leaking roof with nothing more than work gloves and terrible singing. The guy who somehow convinced nervous strangers to smile naturally whenever he pointed a camera toward them. Wildlife photography had never been just a job for Ethan. It was the language he spoke best. He could spend hours waiting for a fox to step into perfect morning light and somehow never complain. Mason admired that patience even if he teased Ethan for carrying camera lenses that cost more than his truck. One day, Ethan often said with an easy grin, "I'm going somewhere people only dream about." Mason would shrug, steal one of Ethan's fries, and answer, "Just send pictures." It sounded simple, safe, permanent, like every other conversation they had ever shared. Neither of them realized those little promises quietly carried the weight of an entire future. Looking back, Mason would later remember that spring afternoon with impossible clarity. Sunlight spilled through the diner windows. Ethan laughed at something completely forgettable. Mason laughed too. It felt ordinary, comfortably ordinary. And maybe that was the biggest mistake of all. Because the most dangerous thing about happiness isn't that it disappears. It's that it quietly convinces you it never will. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while Ethan was editing photographs of a bald eagle soaring above a frozen lake in northern Minnesota. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another polite rejection or a newsletter he had forgotten to unsubscribe from months ago. Instead, he clicked it open, read the first sentence once, then twice, before leaning back in his chair with a laugh so disbelieving that even he did not recognize the sound. His application had been accepted. The North American Wildlife Conservation Initiative wanted him to document endangered species across Alaska for an entire year. Airfare, housing, equipment support, everything covered. Ethan stared at the screen until the words blurred together. This was the opportunity he had chased since college, the kind of assignment photographers talked about for years but almost never received. For a long moment, he simply sat there, fingers resting on the keyboard, wondering why excitement felt strangely tangled with hesitation. His first instinct was not to call his parents. It was not to celebrate online. It was to grab his truck keys and drive across town. Mason was replacing smoke detectors at the county fire station when Ethan walked into the garage carrying 2 coffees and wearing the smile that always meant he was trying to hide something enormous. One of the firefighters nudged Mason with an elbow. "Your other half is here." Mason laughed automatically, wiping grease from his hands with an old towel. "About time. I was wondering who stole my afternoon coffee." Ethan handed him the cup without saying a word. Mason noticed the silence immediately. "All right," he said, narrowing his eyes. "What did you do?" Ethan smiled wider. "Nothing." That is exactly what someone says before admitting they accidentally bought a boat. Ethan shook his head and pulled out his phone instead. "Read it." Mason skimmed the email, then looked back at Ethan with genuine surprise before breaking into a grin. "You got it." Ethan nodded. "I actually got it." Mason did not hesitate. He wrapped Ethan in a quick, crushing hug that nearly spilled both coffees across the concrete floor. "I knew you would," he said. "I told you they would be crazy not to pick you." Ethan laughed into the embrace. "You also told me not to check my email until after lunch because rejection is easier on a full stomach." "That was excellent advice." They laughed together, the sound echoing through the station, and for a few minutes everything felt exactly the way it always had. Then Ethan quietly added, "It starts in 6 weeks." The words settled between them with surprising weight. Mason nodded once, still smiling. "That is soon." "Yeah." "For how long?" Ethan hesitated. 12 months. Mason repeated the number silently in his head. 1 year. For seasons. Birthdays. Holidays. Friday dinners. Fishing trips. Home improvement weekends. A full year suddenly stretched before him like a highway disappearing beyond the horizon. He forced another smile, because that was what best friends were supposed to do. "You have to go," he said without missing a beat. "This is everything you ever wanted." Ethan searched his face as if expecting to find disappointment hidden somewhere behind the encouragement. Instead, he only found confidence. Or at least what looked like confidence. "You really think so?" Mason gave his shoulder a light shove. "I think Alaska has no idea how lucky it is." Ethan finally relaxed, relief softening his expression. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about hiking trails, grizzly bears, frozen camera batteries, and whether Ethan would survive an entire year without decent cheeseburgers. Mason laughed at every joke. He sounded exactly like himself. Only later that evening, after Ethan drove home and the garage fell quiet again, Mason caught himself reaching for his phone to send Ethan another message before realizing they had already talked for 3 straight hours. The station suddenly felt much larger than it had that morning, and for reasons he could not explain, far quieter too. The next few weeks slipped by faster than either of them expected, measured not by calendar pages but by cardboard boxes, equipment checklists, and conversations that somehow never lasted quite long enough. Ethan's small house slowly transformed into organized chaos. Camera cases lined the hallway. Hiking boots waited by the front door. Folded winter gear covered the dining room table in neat stacks. Every day, another small piece of his ordinary life disappeared into a shipping box labeled Anchorage. Mason volunteered to help almost every evening. At first, it felt natural. They assembled storage shelves, packed books, donated old furniture, and argued over whether anyone actually needed 3 different coffee mugs while living alone in the wilderness. Ethan insisted each mug had sentimental value. Mason insisted they all looked exactly the same. The debate lasted 20 minutes and somehow ended with pizza instead of progress. It should have felt normal. Instead, something invisible had begun shifting between them. Mason noticed it in strange moments. Ethan no longer answered every phone call immediately because he was busy preparing permits or meeting with project coordinators. Their Friday dinners became Tuesday lunches or hurried breakfasts before sunrise. Sometimes entire days passed before they spoke, not because either of them wanted distance, but because life had suddenly become crowded with deadlines. Mason told himself it was temporary, yet every small change landed somewhere inside him with surprising weight. One Saturday afternoon, he drove to Ethan's house without calling first, balancing 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard carrier the way he had done countless times before. He knocked once before letting himself in, expecting to hear music or the familiar clicking of camera shutters. Instead, he stopped in the doorway. The living room looked almost empty. Picture frames were gone. Bookshelves stood bare. Even the old couch where they had watched football every Thanksgiving had been sold. The house echoed. Ethan appeared from the hallway carrying another box and smiled. "You picked a great time. I was just wondering how I was supposed to carry this by myself." Mason reached for the box automatically. It was lighter than it looked. "The place feels different," he said quietly. Ethan glanced around and nodded. "I guess it does." For a second, neither of them spoke. Mason realized it was not the furniture he missed. It was the feeling that this place would always be waiting exactly as it had been. Later that evening, they sat on the back porch eating takeout from paper containers while the sun disappeared behind rows of maple trees. Ethan talked excitedly about mountain ranges, migrating caribou, and photographing wolves from a safe distance. Mason listened carefully, smiling in all the right places, but every new story Ethan imagined seemed to happen in a world where Mason did not exist. That thought settled into his chest like a stone he could not quite move. "You are awfully quiet," Ethan finally said. Mason looked toward the fading orange sky. "Just tired." Ethan studied him for another moment before nodding. "You have been working too much." Mason almost laughed because that explanation sounded easier than the truth. The truth was confusing. He was not angry that Ethan was leaving. He was proud. He wanted this dream to come true more than anyone. So why did every packed box feel like someone quietly erasing pieces of his own routine? Why did the thought of 12 months suddenly feel impossibly long? He had no answers. Only a growing sense that something important was slipping through his fingers long before Ethan ever boarded the plane. 3 days. Before his scheduled departure, Ethan accepted one final assignment from the conservation team. It was supposed to be simple. A short drive into a protected mountain reserve to photograph a pair of recently tagged golden eagles before leaving for Alaska. The forecast promised clear skies, mild temperatures, and light winds. "Easy practice," Ethan joked as he loaded his camera bags into the back of his SUV. Mason happened to stop by just as Ethan was tightening the last strap around a weatherproof equipment case. "You really cannot take 1 week off, can you?" Mason asked with a smile. Ethan shrugged. "Apparently not. Besides, I want to make sure every piece of equipment works before I end up hundreds of miles from the nearest camera store." Mason laughed, but something inside him resisted the idea of Ethan driving alone into the mountains. "Want some company?" he offered. Ethan shook his head gently. "You have a full shift today. I will be back before dinner. Maybe we can grab burgers afterward." Mason nodded. "Deal." Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, rolled down the window, and flashed the same relaxed grin Mason had seen thousands of times over the years. "Do not start eating without me. I make no promises." They bumped fists through the open window before Ethan drove away, disappearing around the corner beneath rows of early summer trees. At first, the day unfolded exactly as expected. Around noon, Ethan texted a photograph of a soaring hawk with the caption, "Not the eagle, but I will take it." Mason replied with a thumbs-up emoji and returned to reviewing inspection reports. An hour later, another message arrived. "Heading farther into the reserve. Signal might get spotty for a while." Mason answered, "Drive safe." The message showed delivered. Nothing about it felt unusual. Remote areas often meant weak reception. Ethan had warned him countless times about dead zones during previous photography trips. By late afternoon, Mason glanced at his phone again. No new messages. He sent one anyway. "Burger place at 6?" The message remained undelivered. He frowned, but slipped the phone back into his pocket. Probably another valley without service. 6 o'clock. Came and went. The restaurant parking lot slowly emptied as families finished dinner. Mason ordered 2 cheeseburgers anyway, convinced Ethan would walk through the door any minute carrying 2 cameras and apologizing for terrible reception. Instead, the food grew cold. 7:15. Still nothing. Mason called. Straight to voicemail. He called again. The same result. He stared through the diner window as evening settled over the town, the familiar streets suddenly feeling unfamiliar. Ethan had disappeared into silence before, but never after promising he would be back for dinner. By 8 o'clock, Mason was no longer pretending to enjoy his untouched meal. He stepped outside and dialed again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. His heartbeat quickened in a way that made no logical sense. There were dozens of ordinary explanations. A drained battery. A damaged charging cable. A delayed hike back to the trailhead. Every possibility sounded reasonable, yet none of them settled the growing unease pressing against his chest. The sky darkened one shade at a time. Mason climbed into his truck without fully deciding where he was going. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as the engine started. For the first time since Ethan had announced his move to Alaska, a single terrifying thought slipped quietly into his mind before he could push it away. What if this time there was no message waiting once the signal came back? Ethan finally regained a weak cellular signal just after 9 o'clock. The first thing he saw was a screen filled with missed calls, unread messages, and notifications that seemed impossible to count. Before he could unlock his phone completely, it rang again. Mason. Ethan answered immediately. Hey. The silence on the other end lasted only a fraction of a second, but it felt heavier than anything Ethan had ever heard. Where are you? Mason asked, his voice calm in a way that sounded almost unnatural. I am fine. I am so sorry. A fallen tree blocked the access road, and everyone had to wait while the park service cleared it. Then my battery died because I kept reviewing photos on the camera app before I realized I forgot my charger. I borrowed a charging cable from another photographer as soon as we got back. Mason closed his eyes. He had imagined dozens of explanations over the last 3 hours, yet hearing Ethan's familiar voice instantly dissolved every terrifying possibility he had been carrying. You scared me, he admitted quietly. Ethan laughed softly, expecting the comment to be playful, but Mason did not laugh with him. I know. I really am sorry. Where are you now? About 20 minutes outside town. Mason started his truck again without another word. Stay where you are. I will come to you. Ethan frowned. Mason, I can drive home. Just stay there. There was no anger in his voice, only quiet certainty. 25 minutes later, Ethan spotted Mason's pickup pulling into the small scenic overlook where he had stopped. The headlights swept across the parking area before the engine shut off. Mason stepped out and walked over without hurrying, as though moving too fast might somehow make the moment less real. Ethan climbed out of his own vehicle with an apologetic smile. I feel terrible. I should have borrowed a charger sooner. Mason looked him over carefully, noticing the dusty hiking boots, the wrinkled flannel shirt, and the tired expression that came after a long day outdoors. Nothing appeared wrong. Ethan was standing in front of him exactly as he always had. For reasons Mason could not explain, relief hit him so suddenly that he almost laughed from the sheer weight of it. Instead, he pulled Ethan into a firm embrace. Ethan froze in surprise before returning the hug. You really thought something happened to me, he said gently. Mason did not answer right away. He simply stood there for another moment before taking one slow step back. When I could not reach you, nothing else mattered, he admitted. I could not focus on work. I could not eat. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation, but my mind would not believe it. Ethan studied his face with unexpected concern. I have never seen you like this. Neither have I. The words escaped before Mason had time to think about them. He leaned against the side of Ethan's SUV and looked toward the dark outline of the mountains. His heartbeat had finally begun to settle, yet something much deeper had changed. During those endless hours of silence, he had not been afraid of losing a routine, a fishing partner, or the person who always ordered extra pickles. He had been afraid of losing the one person whose presence quietly anchored every ordinary day of his life. That realization settled over him with startling clarity. It did not arrive like lightning or fireworks. It arrived gently, almost peacefully, leaving no room for denial. Mason finally understood that the emptiness he had been feeling since Ethan accepted the Alaska assignment had never been about distance. It had been about love, a truth that had been growing unnoticed through 15 ordinary years until one evening of silence made it impossible to ignore. That night, Mason barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his phone screen filled with unanswered calls and imagined how close he had come to believing a future without Ethan was possible. By sunrise, he had accepted one undeniable truth. His feelings had changed long before he ever recognized them. The mountain road had not created them. It had simply stripped away every excuse he had been hiding behind. Over the following days, ordinary memories began returning one after another, but none of them looked the same anymore. Mason remembered the first apartment Ethan rented after college. The place had almost no furniture except for a worn couch, 2 folding chairs, and dozens of framed photographs leaning against the walls because Ethan could never decide where to hang them. Mason had spent an entire weekend helping him move, even canceling a fishing trip he had planned for months. At the time, he had called it what any friend would do. Now he realized he had never questioned why Ethan always came first. Another memory surfaced while Mason organized inspection reports at work. 3 years earlier, Ethan had dated a woman named Claire for several months. She was kind, funny, and genuinely cared about him. Mason had told everyone she was perfect for Ethan, yet he also remembered feeling strangely irritated every time Ethan canceled their weekend plans. Because he already had dinner with Claire, he had blamed it on missing his best friend. Looking back, the explanation suddenly felt incomplete. Then there had been the Christmas when Ethan surprised him with a handcrafted leather camera strap engraved with the coordinates of the lake, where they first learned to fish together. Mason had laughed, thanked him, and immediately searched online for the perfect gift in return because somehow anything less than perfect never seemed good enough when it came to Ethan. One memory after another quietly rearranged itself until the pattern became impossible to ignore. None of those moments had felt extraordinary while they were happening. Together, they told a story Mason had never bothered to read. Ethan had become the center of his emotional world so gradually that the transition felt invisible until he imagined losing him forever. Yet another question quickly followed. What if Ethan did not feel the same way? The thought lingered through every conversation during Ethan's final preparations. Mason watched Ethan speak excitedly about glaciers, wildlife preserves, and endless northern skies with the bright enthusiasm of someone finally reaching a lifelong dream. How could he interrupt that journey with feelings Ethan had never asked to carry? If he confessed too soon, he risked placing guilt where there should only be excitement. If he stayed silent, Ethan might leave believing their friendship was all Mason had ever wanted. The conflict followed him everywhere. On Ethan's last evening before flying to Alaska, they shared dinner on the back porch one final time. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and fireflies drifted across neighboring yards as the sun disappeared below the horizon. They talked about travel plans, camera batteries, weather forecasts, and whether Ethan would ever get used to weeks of snow. Mason smiled, answered every question, and laughed at every joke, but behind every word another sentence waited patiently, refusing to disappear. He wanted to say that home would not feel like home without him. He wanted to say that 1 year suddenly felt far longer than it ever should. Most of all, he wanted to tell Ethan that somewhere between childhood laughter, ordinary Fridays, and countless quiet moments, friendship had become something deeper than he had ever dared to imagine. Instead, he looked at the stars beginning to appear above them and promised himself that before Ethan disappeared into the Alaskan sky, he would finally find the courage to tell the truth. The morning of Ethan's departure arrived with the kind of bright summer sunshine that made everything feel deceptively ordinary. The airport was less than an hour away, and by 7 o'clock his SUV was already packed with the few remaining bags that had not been shipped ahead. Mason insisted on driving him anyway. "Your truck can stay here until you get back," he said, tossing Ethan the spare house key. "I will make sure it still starts after a year." Ethan smiled. "You just want an excuse to drive it." Mason shrugged. "That is also true." The familiar banter filled the beginning of the drive, but as the miles passed, longer stretches of silence settled comfortably between them. The radio played softly in the background while fields, gas stations, and roadside diners slipped by outside the windows. Ethan rested one arm against the passenger door, watching the scenery disappear behind them. "It still does not feel real," he admitted. Mason nodded. "Maybe because you have been dreaming about it for so long." "Maybe." After another quiet moment, Ethan looked over with a thoughtful expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. Ever since the mountain reserve, you have seemed different." Mason kept his eyes on the highway. "Different how?" "More distracted. Like you are carrying around a conversation you have not had yet." Mason's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around the steering wheel. Ethan had always been unusually good at noticing the things other people missed. For one dangerous second, Mason considered telling him everything right there, somewhere between mile markers and open farmland. Instead, he smiled faintly. "I guess I am still getting used to the idea that my best friend is moving 3,000 miles away." Ethan laughed softly. "I am not disappearing forever." "I know." Yet even as he spoke the words, Mason realized they were no longer enough. 40 minutes later, the airport terminal came into view. Travelers hurried across sidewalks, pulling rolling suitcases while shuttle buses arrived and departed in steady rhythm. Mason parked near the entrance, and together they unloaded the remaining luggage onto the curb. The moment felt strangely suspended, as though time itself had slowed to give them a few extra minutes neither of them knew how to use. Ethan checked his watch. "I should head inside." Mason nodded but did not move. He watched Ethan adjust the strap of his backpack, the same weathered backpack that had accompanied countless weekend trips over the years. Suddenly, every ordinary detail felt unforgettable. Ethan reached out first and pulled Mason into a brief hug. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. Helping me pack, looking after the house, always showing up." Mason closed his eyes for just a heartbeat. You never had to thank me. Ethan stepped back with an easy smile, but before turning toward the terminal, he hesitated. Promise me something. Anything. Do not let a whole year go by before you come visit. Alaska is too beautiful to experience alone. Mason looked at him for a long moment. The sentence echoed inside him with unexpected force. Too beautiful to experience alone. He realized then that if Ethan walked through those sliding glass doors without knowing the truth, Mason would spend the next 12 months wondering whether fear had stolen the one chance that truly mattered. Ethan started to turn away, but Mason heard his own voice call out before doubt could silence it again. Ethan. Ethan stopped immediately and looked back. The crowd continued moving around them, suitcases rolling across the pavement, announcements drifting through the warm morning air, while for Mason the entire world seemed to narrow to the distance of a few steps between them. He took a slow breath, finally ready to say the words he should have understood years ago. For a moment Ethan simply stood there, searching Mason's face with quiet curiosity. The usual confidence was gone. In its place was an honesty so unfamiliar that it immediately caught Ethan's attention. Mason took one slow breath, knowing there was no perfect speech waiting somewhere in his mind. There was only the truth. I have been trying to convince myself that I was only afraid of missing my best friend, he said. But after the other night, when I could not reach you, I realized I was lying to myself. Ethan remained silent, giving him space to continue. I kept thinking about what life would look like if you never came home. It was not the fishing trips or the Friday dinners that scared me. It was waking up every morning knowing you would never laugh at one of my terrible jokes again. It was never hearing you tell me to slow down because I always walked too fast. It was realizing that every version of my future I had ever imagined somehow included you, and I never stopped to ask why. Mason let out a nervous laugh that carried years of unspoken emotion. Somewhere along the way, friendship stopped being enough for my heart. I just did not notice until I thought I might lose you. The sounds of the busy terminal faded into the background. Travelers continued checking bags, greeting loved ones, and hurrying towards security, but neither of them paid attention anymore. Ethan looked at Mason for a long time before speaking. Do you know what I kept hoping you would say during the last few weeks? Mason blinked in surprise. Ethan smiled gently, though there was unmistakable emotion in his eyes. Anything that would make leaving harder. Mason frowned, unsure he had heard correctly. Ethan continued before he could interrupt. When I accepted the Alaska assignment, I told myself that if our friendship was really as strong as I believed, we would be fine. But every night, I also found myself wondering if there was something neither of us had been brave enough to admit. Mason stared at him in disbelief. Ethan laughed softly. Do you remember when Claire and I stopped seeing each other? Mason nodded. You said the timing was not right. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. Ethan looked down for a moment before meeting Mason's eyes again. Every serious relationship I tried somehow felt incomplete, and I could never explain why. I kept comparing everyone to the person who already knew every embarrassing story, every bad habit, every dream I had ever shared. I just never let myself finish that thought. A quiet smile spread across Mason's face, almost impossible to control. So what happens now? He asked. Ethan glanced toward the departure board where boarding time continued drawing closer. Then he looked back at Mason with calm certainty. I still have to get on that plane. Mason nodded immediately. I know. I do not want you to stay. I never wanted that. This opportunity is part of who you are. Ethan stepped closer until only a few inches separated them. And what if I go anyway? Then I will cheer for every photograph you take. I will answer every phone call no matter what time it is. I will visit you like I promised. I am telling you this because you deserve to know how I feel, not because I expect you to give up your dream. Ethan's smile grew warmer than Mason had ever seen before. Good, he said quietly, because I would never forgive you if you asked me to choose. He reached forward and gently took Mason's hand for a brief moment, giving it a reassuring squeeze before letting go. Wait for me, Ethan said. Mason smiled through the emotion filling his chest. As long as it takes. The year passed one ordinary day at a time, and somehow that made it even more meaningful. There were no dramatic promises, no impossible sacrifices, only two people choosing each other again and again across nearly 3,000 miles. Mason learned the time difference by heart, so he would never call while Ethan was hiking through remote valleys or waiting quietly for the perfect photograph. Ethan learned exactly when Mason usually finished work and often surprised him with video calls just as the evening sun settled behind the mountains. Sometimes they talked for an hour, sometimes only for 5 minutes. It never seemed to matter. What mattered was hearing the familiar voice waiting on the other end. Ethan sent photographs of snow-covered peaks glowing beneath the northern lights, curious foxes standing silently beneath pine trees, and rivers so clear they reflected the entire sky. Mason framed several of those photographs in his living room, smiling every time someone asked where they had come from. "From the best photographer I know," he always answered. As winter became spring and spring slowly returned to summer, the countdown on Mason's calendar finally reached 0. Instead of waiting for Ethan to come home, he boarded a plane to Alaska carrying only one suitcase and a small velvet box that had remained hidden inside his dresser for nearly 12 months. He had bought it only a week after their conversation at the airport, not because he expected everything to happen quickly, but because for the first time in his life he felt completely certain about where his future belonged. Ethan met him outside the tiny regional airport with the same easy smile that had greeted Mason for more than half his life. The distance between them disappeared in seconds. Neither of them said much at first. They simply embraced, laughing quietly at how strange it felt that something they had waited an entire year for now seemed wonderfully ordinary. Over the next few days, Ethan showed Mason the places he had come to love. They walked beside crystal lakes, watched bald eagles circle above distant cliffs, and stood together beneath a sky painted with ribbons of green light that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. On their final evening, they climbed a gentle overlook where the valley stretched endlessly below them. The air was cool, peaceful, and filled only with the sound of wind moving through tall evergreens. Mason reached into his jacket pocket and smiled. "Do you remember what you told me at the airport?" Ethan nodded. "I asked you to wait for me." Mason opened the small velvet box. Inside rested a simple platinum ring that reflected the fading light of the evening sky. "I did exactly that," he said softly. "And now I would like to spend every ordinary day after this waiting beside you instead of waiting for you." Ethan looked at the ring for only a moment before his eyes returned to Mason's. His smile answered first. "You know," he said with a quiet laugh, "for someone who always claims he is terrible with words, you finally found the right ones." Mason smiled back. "Is that a yes?" Ethan slipped his hand into Mason's with gentle certainty. "It has been yes for longer than either of us understood." They stood together as the first stars appeared above the mountains, surrounded by the quiet beauty Ethan had always dreamed of capturing through a camera lens. This time, however, no photograph was needed. Some moments were never meant to be framed. They were meant to be lived, remembered, and carried forward into every ordinary tomorrow together.